Seth Denizen is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He's a researcher, design practitioner who trained in human geography, evolutionary biology, landscape architecture. He's a recipient of the 2019 SOM Foundation Research Prize and a Princeton Mellon Fellow in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities.
Thanks, Anna. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with you all today. As Anna mentioned, part of what I do leads me to have conversations with people in a number of different disciplines. So a lot of what I'm going to try to do is, in some sense, be a kind of translator or a bridge builder to different ways of thinking about problems that you're probably already familiar with. And I'm hoping that opens up a conversation, what I would call wastewater treatment plant politics. And I recently wrote a book with my partner Montserrat Bombay about this in a book called Thinking Through Soil. And so what I'll do is I'll take you through that argument, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about it. The subject that I wanted to talk to you about, which is what you see here in the Mezquital Valley. And before I get into this question of what was, I think, so strange and so confusing about the Mezquital Valley that I had to spend 7 years thinking about it. Before I get into that particular question, I just want to orient you really quickly to where that is in the world. So what you're looking at here is a series of maps of the growth of Mexico City. So this boundary here that you see is the municipal boundary. And then inside of that boundary, you can see how big the city was in 1910 and 1930 and et cetera. And then at the top is the Mezquital Valley. And so what happened is that in 1910, Mexico City canal, that the city's sewage and wastewater system, to this agricultural valley that you see in the north above. So if we kind of zoom in, looks like a thumbs up, that's the Mezquital Valley, and the area that's irrigated by the wastewater and sewage below. And of course, as the city grows, so you can see already by 1930, Mexico City is a little bigger. And then not coincidentally, the Mezquital as well, the area irrigated by that wastewater grows as well. So more city equals more agriculture here, because more city equals more water. So they're taking that water, they're sending it. By 1975, there's now not just a surface canal, but there's a 10-meter diameter pipe underground that delivers this water to the valley. As the city grows exponentially after the 1970s, again, we see them growing proportionally until today, where you can see that these two entities are connected not by one, but by three different pipes that bring the wastewater to the valley from the Mexico City. And this is the pipe we're talking about, right? This kind of enormous engineering project, all of Mexico's wastewater, because Mexico City is in a here. You can see Mexico, the kind of topographic boundary of Mexico City, and the line, that's the basin, everything to the center of the city. So to get all of that water out, the pipe has to transgress that topographic boundary of the basin to reach the Mezquital Valley, which you see in that shaded area in the north. So these are the two very large pipes, the drenaje profundo and which is the emisor central, and the large pipes. And then the Grand Canal is the original surface canal that was in the early 20th century. And all of that wastewater, untreated wastewater, to the irrigated area up in the Mezquital Valley, which is about 60, 70 kilometers away. The first stop on a path is actually this giant lake here called Endo, which I'll show you some images of later. It's the world's largest sewage lake, basically. And right below it, you can see a flag that says Atotonilco PTAR. So until recently, all of this area was irrigated with untreated wastewater and sewage from Mexico City. And then in 2017, a new treatment online, right where it's at Atotonilco, which is called the Atotonilco Wastewater Treatment Plant. And the idea was that really for the first time, Mexico City would start treating some of the water to the Mezquital Valley. And this is where the story starts to get interesting because, a wastewater treatment plant, I'm sure you you probably think of them as pretty miraculous things. They do a great job at what to do. They clean the water they run. Wastewater treatment plants are pretty amazing. Sanitation in ways. But when the wastewater treatment plant in Mexico, there were these massive protests, and I some of these protests, and these are the images that you see on the left are protests. And it's thousands of farmers that are blocking. You can see the Atontonilco sign in the upper left-hand corner. Thousands of farmers marching to occupy and blockade the entrance to the wastewater treatment plant so the workers can get in or out. And this. So the question that a country that has really possible that you could have this amount of kind of resistance to the building of this wastewater, $1 billion. It's a public-private partnership with Carlos Slim's investment. Some of the money came from Carlos Slim, and some of the money came from taxpayer money. And the other thing that made it to understand was that at the time, so in 2017, when these protests were happening, there were also protests all over Mexico about the theft of oil from pipelines in Mexico. And what was happening was that of cartels organized were siphoning oil pipelines, national oil, and then putting it on tankers in the Gulf, making massive profits that should have been going to build things like schools and roads, were instead getting kind of siphoned off. And there was a suspicion that involved, and the people in the government were involved with this theft. And so at the same time, we're accusing of colluding with the cartels to steal the national farmers in the Mezquital Valley. We're trying to accuse the government of stealing the organic matter out of the wastewater, which is how they saw the treatment plant. So essentially, their argument was that the giant $1 billion treatment plant at Tontonilco that you see here was taking Mexico City's wastewater and removing the organic matter that used to fertilize their fields, and then selling that as biogas and basically sludge as a soil to flow wastewater to their fields to fertilize their fields as it had always done. So this is the kind of impasse that I kind of came across studying this. Government really says here in Spanish that it's sort of restitution for a historic. That debt is essentially the of sort of like polluting the environment and sending them out treatment plant. They have paid their debt to the Mezquital Valley by cleaning up water. But for the farmers, that debt looked really. There's a couple different ways about debt. For the farmers, the main debt that they're thinking about is the debt that they were going to have to go into in order to buy synthetic fertilizer to replace the free fertilizer that used to come in the wastewater. And that's a different kind of debt altogether. So think about what the wastewater treatment plant was really doing in a kind of material way. One of the arguments that the farmers were making was that the wastewater treatment plant was really replacing a kind of treatment of instead of chronic the waste solving or treating acute conditions, but chronic conditions. So what are the acute conditions? Well, the acute conditions are everything you see on the left, right? Salmonella, Giardia, Helminth worms, E. coli, amoebas, right? These worms, the Ascaris kind of stuff that comes in untreated wastewater from a major urban city, now 24 million people, maybe. That's all. The wastewater treatment plant does a really good job of getting rid of that stuff, of essentially killing these organisms. And a lot of the biogas that's produced is, in a sense, the microbial decomposition that renders the bodies of the wastewater treatment do is it didn't address the lack of free fertilizer, the kind of lessening of the free fertilizer that was a result of this. And they also weren't heavy metals, which were in the wastewater coming from Mexico City, and that the wastewater plant wasn't really able to remove. So heavy metals are still getting through. And those are both kind of chronic long-term conditions. So there's one other have to have, this particular sort of political impasse. And this is actually, I found that almost no one understood when I started studying this, which was that this conflict over wastewater came very particular historic context. There's anthropologist and filmmaker Paul Leduc and Roger Bartra, who in 1976 made a film sobre el Mezquital, so notes on the Mezquital, and the title is called Ethnocidio. And what they tried to document in the 1970s was the immense sort of poverty and immiseration of the indigenous 70s. So here the film opens with this funeral for a child. The film talks about there being for 600 people in the valley, endemic, a kind of a sort of rural poverty looked like. And historically, the poverty of this region had been blamed agricultural. So Mogamio is the anthropologist who essentially documented Tenochtitlan for the first time, the world plan. If you ever go to Mexico City, at the airport, someone will try to sell you tickets to go pyramids at Tenochtitlan. Manuel Gamio is the kind of national, the sort of anthropology, probably sort of by the Mezquital, which is considerations on problems in Mezquital Valley. And in this, he's pretty clear about what the problem is. The problem who don't know how to farm, who are kind of not civilized, who are dirty because they don't take water, sad by physical constitutions, like they're so was a geneticist who believed in racial biological ideas of intelligence and health. His contemporaries century. So he would have been writing this in the 1930s. And the whole kind of solution to indigenous poverty in the Mezquital, but a case for the solution was built around irrigation. So Mexicans in and starts building centers of social integration for indigenous people. And namely what they do is they start building irrigation in a diet of indigenous people. So not only are they not farming correctly, but they're not eating the right things. It might surprise many of you to know that at this time, eating tortillas was considered something like only poor people do, right? Now we go to Mexico City and tortillas are really celebrated. But at the time, tortillas were associated with sort of poverty and backwardness, and big push to planting soybeans. So also Manuel Gamio arguing that we need to start planting soybeans in Mezquital. And of course, he did start planting soybeans and soybeans in this arid region, high altitude region, require irrigation. So the origin of irrigation in the Mezquital Valley is also really around this of we need to basically civilize and clean up the indigenous population. This is the Indo sewage that I had mentioned earlier. This is what it looks like today. We go back to that particular moment, we can see that Presa was constructed between 47 and 51 in order to irrigate the indigenous of the Mezquital Valley. It was specifically targeting indigenous farming. And if we make a of irrigation built to parts of the valley, we also start to see that irrigation map is a kind of soil map, because the areas that have been irrigated with untreated wastewater for longer have different properties, physical, chemical, structural properties than soils that haven't been irrigated as long. What I started my research was to try to actually understand all of the soil forming processes that were soil over time, kind of separate the book into three, what I'm calling horizons. And we could might be a confusing word for soil scientists who are used to thinking about horizons in different ways. Thinking about horizon would mean in a post-natural soil is sort of a confusing concept that needs to be sort of unpacked. And in the book, what I'm is that there's really three post-natural horizons in the Mezquital Valley that start with the irrigation of the soil with underwater. And so this is the sort of portrait of the soil that I produced. Each one of these kind of characters that you see in the soil forming process is a different human or non-human process that affects the formation of the soil in some way. Here I'm going to highlight in green these kinds of triangles, which I am thinking of metallic compounds. So are both organic matter in the soil as well as place. And so representing the heavy metals in the soil is important, as well as the organic matter. That it's really is because all the organic matter that the treated wastewater brings to the soil's capacity to bind heavy metals that also come in. So it's this kind of strange that more wastewater irrigation you have, the more heavy metal, but also the more organic matter you have in the soil to bind those heavy metals to keep them from entering the food chain. This is one of the main concerns of the farmers, is that if the wastewater treatment plant stops sending them high levels of organic matter in the wastewater, the levels of organic matter in their soil will drop, and then that will solubilize legacy heavy metals from a century of wastewater irrigation, and then that will make their farm fields too toxic to farm. We could also think of it come in the way. So there's antibiotics in the wastewater, as all of you know, survive the environment of the body pretty well, and so also survive the internal environment of the sewage system pretty well. And they are to the soils in the Mezquital Valley in concentrations that are very low. But of course, as you know, low concentrations of antibiotics are the perfect environment for the evolution of antibiotic. What we see in the soils of the Mezquital Valley, we see a ton of antibiotic resistance, multi-drug antibiotic resistance in the bacteria in the soil. What else do we see in the soil? So we also see effects of corn cultivation, and there's two different ways of grown, especially after NAFTA, that requires a ton of irrigation and a ton of fertilizer. And so we have water and fertilizer that's transforming the soil as also sort of exist in a way. It wasn't for the requirements of this particular corn. Varieties require much less water and much less nitrogen. And there's something about this particular story that also is really worth to, which is that the most drug that we find in the soil, a drug called metformin, diabetes medication. It's one of the highest incidents of diabetes in the world. When 1 in 3 people are projected to have diabetes in Mexico by like 2040. It's a rapidly issue. It's one of the most serious problems, and a ton of medication for it, and that of course winds up in the soil. But I think what's also important to understand about that, especially in the corn, is that when NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, sort of devastated Mexico's corn, because all of the corn started to come from, actually we're sitting, American Midwest. What that did is it actually started to make corn syrup-based softer than water in Mexico. So it was cheaper to buy a liter of Coke than it was to buy a liter of water. So when we think about the rise of the diabetes epidemic in Mexico, it's kind of impossible to think about that rise without thinking about the hybrid corn, without thinking about the corn syrup-based soft drinks that make Mexico's consumption the highest in the world. So Mexico consumes syrup-based soft drinks than any other country on earth. And I mean, I think that's kind of in that sense, we can start to irrigate with the medication that's our overconsumption, that hybrid corn vis-a-vis corn syrup. That's probably one of the clearest indications that we could have of something going wrong with our food system. So, I mean, I think what I want to kind of leave you with is one of the happening here system is that this is sort of becoming a reciprocal image of the urban environment. So all of our environmental toxicity, all of our sort of the kind of material conditions of urban life are then becoming reflected itself. And we look at that soil, we're seeing a kind of mirror image of our own bodies, of our own metabolic relationships. So to study the soil in the Mezquital Valley is really to study the kind of physical, corporeal, metabolic environment of Mexico City, and really vice, of course, things that are grown in the Mezquital, then to Mexico City as produce, as things that people eat. So in that sense, the question this really leaves us with, goodness, about how the systems should kind of become more. Then the question that we would really be asking is, how do we imagine an environment that would produce a fertile soil in a sustainable way? How could we imagine an urban environment that was actually producing a quality of that could be reused sustainably in order to create healthy metabolic relationships between the urban and the rural rather than toxic ones? And that's the kind of question of the book. And in that sense, I think that this kind of that started talking with the farmers and the government is really, in some sense, poorly phrased, because it's not about the wastewater treatment plant stealing organic matter. It's also about this larger question of how they can start to be rethought in relationship to a soil. How could a soil help us think about what we want the urban look like, and how could our urban life something that looked more livable, more sustainable in all kinds of different ways, toxicity, but in terms of its capacity to produce health and well-being in its citizens.